Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Marisa Jones, and I'm the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Safe Routes Partnership. We are so grateful to all of you for joining us today for our working webinar in partnership with Bike Walk KC. The Safe Routes Partnership is a national nonprofit that works to advance safe walking and rolling to and from schools and in everyday life, improving the health and well-being of people of all races, income levels, and abilities and disabilities, and building healthy, thriving communities for everyone. Bike Walk KC is a Greater Kansas City nonprofit organization that works to redefine streets as places for people to build a culture of active living. A few logistical items. I know probably this far into the pandemic, folks are very well acquainted with Zoom and all of its functionality, but we'll just take a moment to go over it just in case. So everyone will be muted during this beginning presentation, but the chat function is open, so you are welcome to use the chat to ask questions or engage in dialogue with one another at any point throughout the presentation. And in order to do so, you press on the little bubble icon on the bottom right of your screen to chat to one another. Please feel free, we know that Zoom fatigue is real, so please feel free to turn off your camera if that's how you're most comfortable during the presentation. And we would encourage you, but not require you, to come off of video during the breakout sessions, just really to foster a learning environment and connecting with one another. Another logistical item that we want to make sure we highlight for all of you is that we will be recording this opening presentation only. We are not going to be recording the question and answer period, and we're not going to be recording the breakout sessions. We recognize that this is a learning space for so many of us, and really want to encourage people to feel free to ask the questions that they have. And so we will not be recording that component of the session. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about the agenda. So I am so excited to welcome you all here. We will provide an opening framing. We'll then turn it over to Michael Kelly of Bike Walk KC for a presentation. We then have the opportunity to ask questions for Michael and his colleagues. And then we'll take about 20 minutes to break out into small groups. We have pulled together a couple of questions to nurture some dialogue, and we really are envisioning this as an opportunity for people to learn from and with one another. Those breakout groups will be lightly facilitated by staff from Bike Walk KC and Safe Routes Partnership. So we also encourage you all to use this space to really connect with one another, ask the questions that you have, share resources, ideas with one another. And then we'll come back together and wrap up. So that's the plan for this next hour together. I'd love to start by really trying to take a pulse on where folks are at with this. Where is your organization or your community or you as an individual, where are you at in the process of working to analyze and repeal or modify laws related to walking and bicycling? So there's a poll on your screen. We'll have this open for about a minute. Are you at the stage of really understanding the concept? Are you contemplating or exploring options? Are you developing legislation? Are you at another point? And if you're at a different point in the process, we would love to hear about it. You know, as much as we're all encouraging you to learn from one another, we are definitely still in a learning space too. So we'll leave this open for a minute or so. Okay, looks like a lot of folks are here to understand the concept, which is great. That's terrific. Got some folks, a good amount of people really exploring their options, maybe they've taken some of the first steps of analyzing what's happening in their communities. A good number of people working on developing legislation, and others in the chat. Okay, so we'll go ahead and close that for now. But thanks everyone for sharing that. So yeah, about 65% of people here are here to understand the concept. Others are exploring options locally. That's about 36%, 12% developing legislation, and 8% other. So hopefully those others are coming in the chat. Okay. Okay, so I'd like to take just a couple of moments right now to really frame this discussion, how we got here and why we're having this conversation. At the Safe Routes Partnership, almost a year ago in June 2021, we replaced enforcement with engagement in the 6 E's of Safe Routes to School framework. And in doing so, we committed to invest in research, tools, and resources to support communities to do the same. Since we made that statement back in June of 2021, we have hosted more than a dozen trainings on new strategies for communities. We have developed 8 publications and resources. And this Taking on Traffic Laws guide and webinar are the results of that investment in building out the new 6 E's framework. And Bike Walk KC's work in Kansas City is the result of evaluation, engagement, and their ongoing commitment to equity as they work towards safer, more connected, and equitable places for people to walk and bike without relying on enforcement as a primary strategy for active transportation safety. To further frame why we're focusing on the opportunity to repeal or modify traffic laws related to walking and bicycling, we considered the fact that we eagerly evaluate engineering countermeasures to see if they're having their intended outcomes. And we measure educational curricula to gauge if people are learning. But we haven't always applied that same curiosity to enforcement. As the background section of the Taking on Traffic Laws guide clearly lays out, evaluations of how traffic laws related to walking and bicycling are enforced clearly show that the enforcement of these laws is not applied evenly across racial, ethnic, and demographic groups. Black people are most likely to live in neighborhoods without supported infrastructure for walking and bicycling, and are also most likely to be cited for pedestrian and bicycle-related violations. And the racialized enforcement of traffic stops related to walking and bicycling has harmful and even deadly consequences. As organizations that encourage people to walk and bike and strive for safer outcomes for all road users, we can't rely on strategies that have such disparate and inequitable impacts in our communities. With an eye to reimagining a more equitable active transportation system, Bike Walk KC is leading the movement for a local level evaluation and modification of traffic laws that lead to racialized enforcement of people walking and bicycling. Kansas City, Missouri was the first city in the country to make jaywalking illegal back in 1912. So when we heard that it was also the first local government to repeal that law, we knew that we needed to learn more. And so we are so happy to invest in Bike Walk KC to develop this guide and then collaborate with them to develop this tool that really shines a light on their experience and makes actionable recommendations for other communities. I'm so pleased to turn it over to Michael Kelly from Bike Walk KC, and we will drop his bio in the chat as well. Take it away, Michael.
All right. Thank you, Marisa, and thank you everyone for taking some time out of your day to join us and to talk further about this. Can I get a thumbs up to see if folks can see my screen? Okay, excellent. So again, the presentation I'm going to give today is about understanding the how-to guide for decriminalizing mobility, and the date of our webinar is not lost on me. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that today is the 1-year anniversary of the conviction of Derek Chauvin, the police officer who strangled George Floyd to death. The work that we do here and the work that we do in many parts of the country would not be possible if not for the unfortunate outcomes of interactions like those. And I want to acknowledge that very important anniversary today. And let's see now. And of course, let's see. There we go. Okay. So really quickly, I want to give an outline of what I'll be discussing here. Really quickly, talking about how to use the identification process for identifying the laws that need to be changed, how to frame your messaging and responses when discussing decriminalization, considerations around building an effective coalition, and I will finish my remarks by talking about how you can learn from the mistakes that Bike Walk KC made. So before I jump into the main content, I wanted to take a moment to tell you a story which underscores why our work on decriminalization must continue even in the Kansas City region. It's about a man named Justin Layton. On Valentine's Day night 2020, Justin crossed a street which had the green light for drivers but the orange hand for pedestrians, crossing a street with little to no traffic at the time. An officer saw him and decided to stop him for jaywalking. That decision led to a violent arrest in which two more officers jumped on Justin while he was face down in the snow and, according to Justin, held him in a chokehold. In February of this year, Justin filed a lawsuit against the officers who arrested him and the city of Independence, which borders Kansas City, Missouri. He alleges in the lawsuit that the arresting officers violated his civil rights because he was accused of jaywalking by one of the officers. During a recent interview with the Kansas City Star, Justin was unequivocal. He wants communities across the region to follow the model of Kansas City, Missouri, and remove their jaywalking laws. His reason for this is simple. It gives the cops another reason to mess with you. So with that in mind, I want to begin by talking about the identification process and how you can make the steps of identifying these unjust laws work better for your organization and your community. So I want to begin by talking about why we should modify the process. When we said that this guide was a guide, not the guide, we meant it. The first big reason for why you may need to modify the identification process of questionable traffic laws is because legal parameters differ. The obvious part here is that KC-Mo is a unique city in that we don't have local control of our police department. This is not something most places have to deal with, so it may warrant an adjustment. The other big consideration here is the question of preemption, or whether or not you can change the law at the local level, or if you need to consider action at the county or state level. An additional aspect to consider with modifying the process is the capacity for your organization and potential coalition considerations. Bike Walk KC is the main organization in KC-Mo that works on bike and pedestrian policy and advocacy because we're the only local organization with the dedicated staff capacity to do that. Other communities may have multiple organizations with the interest and capacity to do this work, and it could be helpful to consider that and try to work collaboratively on this issue with those groups. Even with these considerations, I still want folks to understand that these changes can still yield similar results in terms of identifying questionable laws and then making the case to modify or repeal them. While we want people to understand how we were able to accomplish this work in Kansas City, we also understand that there's only so much you can apply elsewhere before local considerations need to be included. The first big opportunity to modify the process is with the terms you're searching for. So with regards to mobility, this is the first big question to ask as advocates. What does mobility mean in your community? And how have local laws guided that definition? Considering this is important because it can impact both the length of the list and the regional considerations. Speaking of the length, Bike Walk KC ultimately developed a list of 13 terms to help guide our search of the KC-Mo Municipal Code. This is another place where advocates in other communities can modify the process to better support their community. That could mean either shortening the list, perhaps in smaller communities where transit isn't as available, or expanding it, say in larger communities where other forms of transportation, like scooters, may already have dedicated language in the code. The last thing I want to offer for folks on this aspect of the identification process is that there are likely regional considerations with language as well. The way in which KC-Mo talks about walking, accessibility, biking, and transit is likely different from Denver, which is likely different from Atlanta. While we show our process in the guide, we also want folks to be cognizant of local aspects of language which may need to be taken into account when you begin to search for questionable portions of the code. There should also be consideration for who is involved in the process of identifying the laws in questions. When Bike Walk KC went through the review process, we relied on staff exclusively to do this. Part of this was because we wanted to be able to move through the process quickly, given the recent adoption of the anti-racist language resolution in KCMO, but also because we knew that doing so would allow us to focus on active transportation, the portion of the code which we had the capacity to review. With that being said, it is possible that another group may want or need to bring in other partners to be involved in the process as well. This could be especially helpful in places where different organizations focus on walking or biking or accessibility or transit exclusively, as well as communities where various regional organizations may have overlapping areas or interests. Whatever the choice, make the parameters clear before you proceed. Attempting to expand or change the group of people involved could warp the process in a way which makes it difficult to achieve a concrete outcome and something which all of your partners can get behind later on. So with that understanding of the identification process in mind, we can now shift gears and talk more about how to frame your messaging and responses as you talk about the need to decriminalize mobility. So with regards to messaging and responses, it is important to consider questions and pushback you may receive with regards to enforcement. Most immediately, you should be prepared to speak about how such a move will impact funding, specifically for local law enforcement. In KCMO, funding as related to enforcing these laws was never part of the equation, in large part because we don't have local control of the police department. Even if that weren't the case, however, funding wouldn't have been an issue because enforcing these laws is only one part of the broader job of traffic police anyway. The aspect of funding also feeds into the other part of the discussion, which is that focusing less on these low-level offenses allows officers to focus more on places where they can be of better use. We shouldn't be saddling police with a problem they can't solve. If the streets cities design and build are inherently unsafe, the responsibility shouldn't be on the police to fix them. It should be on the city, which designed and built those unsafe streets in the first place. That understanding of who is responsible also plays a role in how we discuss safety as it relates to repealing and modifying these laws. Jaywalking has had its chance. This speaks to the historical trends. Jaywalking has been on the books in many communities for years, if not decades, as Marisa alluded to earlier. Yet we know from organizations like NHTSA and Smart Growth America that injuries and deaths among pedestrians and cyclists have grown, especially in recent years. An effective law would help to keep those numbers low, and yet this law has failed to do that. Beyond the failure of the law itself, the ineffectiveness of jaywalking and related laws has forced communities to adopt new laws to address the unsafe streets communities have. The emergence and staying power of legislation like Complete Streets, for example, shows that there is a true alternative to jaywalking enforcement, but only if we are willing to follow it as we should. And finally, punishment can't fix the pavement. The bottom line is this: we can't rely on enforcement to ensure safe streets. If we want safe streets, we have to build them as such. And that means relying less on police to do something that is unreasonable to expect of them in the first place. Next, I want to talk about building an effective coalition and really identifying and sustaining the right partnerships. So I wanted to start by speaking a bit more about working with partners in the legal community. So with transportation expertise, find someone who works on transportation issues. It doesn't have to necessarily be someone who works exclusively on bike and pedestrian issues, and that may be too narrow of a focus anyway. It can help to have someone with more knowledge on stops for drivers, not only because they can help you identify broader code considerations, but also because it can help to establish that your ask is something which everyone should get behind, not just people who walk, roll, or bike. An additional aspect of legal support to consider is trying to find ways to work with criminal defense attorneys. This is pretty straightforward. When people receive tickets for jaywalking or bike violations, they will hire a defense attorney to fight the ticket if they can't afford it. Attorneys may also be able to provide additional data on trends such as locations or individual aspects like race, age, or sex. Lastly, and with all of the groups you may want to work with, confirm that the partners you speak with are willing to speak up on this issue publicly. Even though someone may be willing to do research on the issue, that may not also mean they are willing to speak up when legislation comes forth. Regardless of the reason that they give for this, understand that this is possible and adjust if such an instance arises. I also wanted to elaborate a bit further on working with each of the groups who identified in the guide as potential partners in this work. Let's begin with housing and how you can find ways to align their efforts with decriminalization. So in Kansas City, there have been moments of confusion and unnecessary confrontation in the past, in part because folks outside of the respective housing and transportation spaces pit those issues against each other. Reaching out to the groups from this space on decriminalization can be a way to break down those walls and build better relationships. When it came to decriminalization, we presented this as an opportunity to help address a clear injustice, which was disproportionately impacting people along racial and socioeconomic lines. Groups like the KC Tenants work in that space on the housing front and were willing to help us because they saw this as something which could impact the people they serve as well. From the neighborhood's perspective, the issue of decriminalizing mobility came down to a question of access. At the neighborhood level, residents and leaders of these communities speak often of what can and can't be accessed, and rightly so. There's also the question of how they access those pieces which contribute to a good quality of life. In the absence of policies and funding to repair things like broken sidewalks or strengthen bus lines, decriminalization offers one way to break down those barriers which limit how neighborhood residents can access what they need to create a good quality of life. Finally, I want to elaborate a bit further on the overlap between sustainability and decriminalization. Sustainability groups are beginning to understand in greater detail the need to support walking and biking because it's integral to making progress on lowering transportation emissions, the nation's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, according to the EPA. In reconsidering the importance of multimodal transportation, there is also an opportunity to shift thinking of the system which enables it to operate. Put another way, the lack of true support for multimodal transportation doesn't just manifest in terms of broken sidewalks, unreliable transit, or non-existent bike facilities. It also manifests in terms of excessive enforcement, which fails to address those fundamental problems. Thus, sustainability advocates have an obligation to work against these systems to ensure a just transition in addition to a clean transition. Finally, I want to end my remarks by talking briefly about how you can learn from the mistakes Bike Walk KC made in this endeavor. One misstep we had early on was not having local data regarding tickets on hand. But beyond simply getting it sooner, consider the following. Confirm your source, do your research, and make sure you know who will be able to provide the information for you on this issue. In Kansas City, we had to rely on the municipal court, but that won't be the case everywhere. Exhaust the categories. Try to find and examine as many categories as possible. While race is the key category to consider for much of the data, consider seeing if additional aspects related to age, sex, or socioeconomic status can be found as well. It's important to consider this because it is possible that more than one disparity may exist in the enforcement of a given law. Consider this. When Seattle recently repealed their helmet requirement, the disparity in the data wasn't just related to race. A local news outlet also discovered that since 2019, cyclists who were homeless were 60% more likely to receive citations under that rule. One other piece of advice I would offer for those considering the data is to specifically look for the frequency of tickets or arrests along these corridors. The primary reason for this is because it could also inform infrastructure improvements down the road. Think about it like this. If we're issuing tickets in some places more than others, it may mean we haven't done enough with the built environment to make it safe to walk or bike in those places as well. Another place where we would do things differently if we could do this process over would be with our starting position. The key lessons we want people in other communities to understand would be, first and foremost, deciding early on your proposed change. Once you complete your identification process, make the decision as an organization and as a coalition on the proposed changes you want to make. Regardless of if you want to just modify a portion of the code or repeal it entirely, the point here is to make the decision on the proposed change before you go any further. Make sure your champion is on board. We assume that once we passed along our letter recommending that measures we identified be removed, that the mayor of Kansas City would stick to that position. We found out later that he only wanted to modify jaywalking rather than repeal it entirely. This illustrates the second point. It's crucial to have frequent communication with the legislative champion and make sure that both sides are clear on what changes should be pursued and that the champion is fine with doing that. If not, learn what the hesitation is or consider finding another champion. And finally, make sure that the language and proposed changes are concrete before you move forward. Once the legislation has been introduced, it becomes harder to change. Anticipate as much as possible if you'll need to make concessions or start with one piece of legislation and follow up later. Again, the point is to make sure that you remain consistent throughout the process. Finally, Bike Walk KC would have done things differently with our outreach if legislative movement had been at a slower pace. The data is a powerful piece of the equation which shows that there is clearly something wrong. But think beyond that. How can you use the story the data tells to not only make the case for the legislative push, but also for the broader changes to streets which can help to make them safer as well? This is as much a question of choosing reporters and outlets who understand that connection as it is making the push on how to tell the story through your own social media channels. Finding stories. This would have been another opportunity to rely on partners, especially those working in criminal defense. They likely have clients who have been charged and are punished under these laws and can speak most definitively to why they need to change. Allow yourself time to find people who are willing to share their experiences with you and potentially the broader public. Finally, there's the challenge of getting this information back to legislators. If you don't have an established relationship with a given legislator, ask your partners if they do. You want to be able to share these stories along with the data to ensure enough decision makers choose and remain in your corner to push for the modification or repeal that you are seeking. So with that, again, I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you all might have.